Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Anna Gavell. I'm the managing editor at Devex. Thank you for braving this dreary DC day to join us. And welcome to our U.S. Global Leadership Series with Congressman French Hill. This is the fourth Newsmaker that we've had in this series, which is a bipartisan set of discussions with lawmakers and other decision makers to advance global development goals. I want to thank our partner today, Food for the Hungry, for supporting us, as well as Microsoft for hosting us in this space. Our discussion will be led by our senior reporter, Adva Saldinger, who is also the author of our Invested newsletter, and of course featuring Congressman Hill, who represents the Arkansas 2nd Congressional District since 2015, and also serves as vice chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about, so I'll take it away.
Thanks, Anna, and welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you. Happy to be with all of you today, and thank you again, Congressman, for being with us. Really looking forward to, diving deep on the World Bank reform and multilateral development banks, the IMF, and Ukraine funding, which I know is an issue that you have thought a lot about, and I know you were recently in Ukraine, so I look forward to hearing about that. Before we dive in, I think, maybe one thing not everyone knows about you is that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, you led the design of U.S. technical assistance to the emerging economies of East and Central Europe, focused on sort of their banking and securities systems. And I just wanted to start by asking you how you think that experience has impacted your views on foreign aid, on foreign assistance, and on sort of the way you look at the international financial architecture today.
Well, it's a good place to start. I had a great 4 years at the Treasury during the Bush 41 administration. 2 years actually in Treasury, and then 2 years assigned by Secretary Brady to go babysit the economic policy operation in the White House. I ran the Economic Policy Council, the predecessor of today's NEC. And that was a great experience, but I was particularly rewarded by the Secretary asking me to help design the transition for Central Europe from a socialist economy, a command and control economy in a very socialistic way under communism and behind the Iron Curtain, to a more market-based economy. And we did that by being, I think, for the USAID folks in the room, the first time that USAID had set up a program and then given the money to somebody else in the government to allocate it. So the Treasury Department received a grant from USAID to design this technical assistance and then implement it ourselves. We didn't have to go back to the State Department. And what we did is we hired lawyers, retired bankers, retired central bankers, retired capital markets executives, and we embedded them in the finance ministries and the central banks of the Central European countries, from Warsaw to Sofia in Bulgaria, and help them essentially write basic laws and create a basic regulatory framework to make that transition. And there were some tremendous success stories in that, and some less so. But that was the theme. It's always colored my viewpoint. I was a Latin American studies and history economics major in college, so I did a lot in Latin American development academically in college. And so all those things have sort of colored my view about rule of law, markets, capital market access as being fundamental to economic progress, and therefore the progress of families in the global South or anywhere else. And making those tough microeconomic decisions are at the heart of success. You're not going to donate your way to success out there. You've got to have that fundamental reform effort in nations.
So, one of the things that Ajay Banga in his, still fairly new leadership of the World Bank has prioritized is sort of bringing in the private sector and is that market development piece. Obviously, the World Bank is, going through a reform process. He's also helped sort of put into place some of these mechanisms to help the bank better leverage its existing balance sheet. And some of those reform efforts are ongoing, right? How to, streamline some of the bureaucracy, which I think for some in this room might also raise some hairs on their arms because they're concerned that you lose some of the accountability if you try to go too fast. But I'm curious how you sort of assess the World Bank reforms so far and what you think the bank should do next.
Well, the new president is a dynamic person and a dynamic business executive with global experience, and he comes at it with that, as I say, that rule of law, capital markets, capital allocation, private sector mentality, which I think is healthy over at the bank. I think David Malpass had that as well, but from a macroeconomic point of view for his both private sector and government sector experience. So you need that sort of catalytic person at the head to try to move this giant machinery of the World Bank. Secretary Yellen, I think, has been supportive of that too. The most important thing they can do is obviously keep their credit rating high and be able to try to use that as leverage. And we've experimented there. I don't know that we've been as successful as we might be in extending the brand and extending that financial capability. But at the heart of it,
what more could they do?
I don't know. I mean, I think Secretary Yellen's talked about it. I mean, the ability to let them indirectly do more with that credit rating is a possibility. Their technical assistance, I think, is very, very valuable, maybe more valuable sometimes than the credit that they extend, honestly. But partnering is key, and they've got the elements to do that. And I think that's where Anjay is potentially headed. And he also wants to make sure he's delivering value, and that gets into the bureaucracy of decision making on extending that credit under what terms and conditions. My view is to stay focused on the core mission of development and fighting poverty through development and being focused on that mission and not have mission creep. I think a bigger challenge personally for me over at the IMF than at the World Bank.
But one of the things that Ajay Banga has done is created a new mission for the bank, which is to fight poverty on a livable planet, which and he's increased the bank's climate targets. So do you see that as mission creep, or do you think that their bank has the ability to focus on climate at the same time as it's focusing on that sort of core poverty?
Not at the way I think he's approaching it, which is an all of the above energy strategy. You have half of Africa without electricity. So to deny them access to the fuel to create power, to create electricity is a mistake. And you're not going to do that with renewables only. So I think his approach is very practically to create economic development opportunity, to reduce poverty, to offer more opportunities for more people to create an economy that works for their own country. And you do that by having affordable power. And so I think he's taking an all of the above approach and not a renewable only approach, which means he should be financing nuclear. It means he should be financing renewables, obviously, but he should also be financing long-term natural gas transition as well. It's an important fuel source to the world to make that transition. And it, in my judgment, is a huge mistake to ban that sort of structural financing by the EBRD, the World Bank, or anybody else in the name of hitting a carbon goal. Because if you want to do that, then you need to transition people away from the dirtiest in an affordable way, and that includes financing nuclear. And I'm pleased that the Biden administration has been supportive of nuclear financing. I think that's a big change. We didn't have that support during the Obama administration. We had it during the Trump administration, but I like seeing that approach from President Biden, and we're now making progress in getting the EBRD to finance.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because I know that's something.
No, it's a priority for me. It is. It's a priority for me.
Where do things stand with that? And how do you see the U.S. using its leverage at the EBRD to get them to make that policy change? Because they've got a lot of other shareholders they have to answer to as well.
Right. Well, I see. I want to see it in print, written in Europe by somebody before I say that it's agreed to. But I hear that there's movement to acknowledge that the EBRD should help finance a more all of the above type policy, including nuclear. And every week in Washington, D.C., those of you in government know this, you're taking meetings all week long from Central European countries, the very countries that I helped in 1990 and 1991, demanding that the U.S. help them get nuclear power, the ultimate clean, carbon-free baseload power source.
How do you address, because some people obviously have concerns about nuclear power, and I think that's one of the reasons it's often been controversial, including in the development community. So how do you sort of address the concerns that people have about nuclear power, how it could be used, the potential risks involved with it?
Well, the risks, I would say, are the source of the power generation, the nuclear power part and the nuclear waste part. And those are all, I think, taken care of by technology and monitoring, and by the fact that these new small modular reactors actually don't produce the kind of waste you see on parking lots all over the United States or other places from old 1965 to 1975, fission reactors. So technology is part of the issue, and then the proper monitoring of it. But you've got to pick your poison here, folks. I mean, you either want low cost, 100-year, 150-year basic power demand that is clean and carbon free, or you have a much more less power certainty for a lot of people. I think that half the population in Africa not having access to electricity should be a priority. And I think this is a very straightforward way to do it, and have, as speaking as an American, as opposed to, a different nationality or a different mission set, we have the technology and expertise to do that. And, let's speak more parochially. Would you, in your country, rather have a Russian reactor or an American reactor? I think I'd rather have an American reactor.
So turning back to the World Bank, you talked about the importance of World Bank technical assistance. The World Bank's IDA is its fund for the poorest countries. Right. Ajay Banga recently said it's the most important thing that the World Bank does. He's also said that he wants this next IDA replenishment to be the biggest ever. It's coming up at the end of this year. And I wanted to first, I guess, flat out ask you, do you support a significant replenishment for IDA? And then what do you think the odds are that the US will be able to step up and make some sort of sizable commitment?
Well, IDA's been an important part of the menu of strategies for the World Bank for a long time. We've got to credit the Eisenhower administration, particularly, for good basic work there to craft it. It deserves replenishment. I think to make an assumption that that's going to be done in an election year is a medium probability event, although it could conceivably be done during a lame duck session of Congress after the election, but before the year end. And I think for a lot of members of Congress, it's about what's the plan and how does it fit into the plan, and what reforms might we achieve on both sides of the aisle that are important, instead of just where we're going to raise the replenishment.
So what do you think should be attached? What should the U.S. be asking for with a replenishment?
Well, I think first, an all of the above energy strategy for the global South, I think, is important. I think graduation from China from World Bank lending status might be something that some on the Republican side of the aisle would be encouraging. Transparency on how the World Bank uses trust funds and how those are monitored would be an area, I think, that could be of interest, so that people know that who's sponsoring the trust fund, what's the transparency around it, what's the mission of it, does it have a sunset, will it end someday, or is this just an exercise in perpetuity? And then I think helping to link back to the big issues that you and I've talked about before, that both the bank and the IMF perform a function of insisting on transparency in sovereign lending to our most impoverished countries, and that we do not facilitate the kind of things that we read about at William and Mary's study of China's lending in their Belt and Road program to the global South, where you have predatory pricing, you have hidden terms, you have conflicts of interest built in, you have requirements to use poor contractors with no record of success, or capturing a commodity basis for repayment and penalizing the country. These things should be enforced, in my judgment, through the World Bank and the IMF's ability to aid and design and use technical assistance with these countries that need the help the most. And those are the kinds of reforms that I'm talking about. Let's stay focused on the mission at hand, which is the health and well-being of people in our poorest countries in the world, and not be caught up with fads in New York, Washington, or Paris. And let's demand change and not be timid about it, and not take the initiative to lead here. And this is a place where the United States can do that. And there have been efforts like Secretary Yellen's effort in the common framework in the G20 on this transparency issue, but they have not worked. I don't want to call it a failure, but it has not been successful. It has not met expectations. Let's leave it like that. We were promised when the SDR issuance in 2021, $650 billion of SDR equivalent were extended, that they would, rich countries would contribute those to the Poverty Reduction Trust Fund. Didn't happen.
The U.S. also hasn't done that.
Ask Secretary Yellen. Ask Secretary Yellen about it, or President Biden about it.
Do you support repurposing
I would
US
support that
SDRs?
with all the reforms I just talked about. You bet. You bet. Nothing for the Resilience Trust Fund, but plenty for the Poverty Reduction Trust Fund would be my personal view. But I'm just one person, and I don't have a vote in this because the administration won't consult with Congress on this.
Why do you
And
think
that's
that
why,
is?
well, I can tell you why it is, because they don't want to. They have a requirement to consult with Congress verbally up to $650 billion based on the ratio of the IMF for SDRs. They did it in a very cursory, perfunctory manner and did it anyway, which is why I have my SDR reform bill for the IMF that reforms the process of how we use special drawing rights. We need reform here. We can't be timid. We need to take the initiative, and we need to lead the way here. So to have a G20 press conference and say we're going to have a common framework and people are going to join the Paris Club for restructuring, and we're going to share our SDR largesse from the Netherlands to the Global South, that's just a press release. I'd like to see action by the leading countries of the world to demonstrate that. And I know it's complicated. I'm not
do you
arguing.
think there would be an appetite in Congress to support repurposing of existing SDRs? Or I know one of the things that you've talked about is, could you create a new issuance of SDRs that is different, that would require some regulatory change at the IMF, that would be specifically for the poorest countries?
Yeah, well, in my reform bill, I propose that we do the unthinkable, which is amend the IMF charter to have a new section which allows for a non-general allocation of special drawing rights. So right now, this is on autopilot. We have a special drawing rights issue, or we don't. So Russia gets special drawing rights, China gets special drawing rights, the Netherlands gets special drawing rights, and the US gets special drawing rights on a pro rata basis of their participation in the IMF, right? Okay. Then we're reliant on a budgetary hit in each of those countries to, quote, transfer their SDRs to the trust fund or directly to a country if they wanted to. I think that's impractical. And you're rewarding authoritarian, terrible countries that have not in the interest, not only of the United States, but generally to the values of the United Nations. I won't even be parochial about US values. And so Iran and Syria and Russia and China and North Korea, well, North Korea is not a member, but if you're a member, you get special drawing rights. So my amendment, and it would take 2/3 of the members to approve it, would be allow us to do a special drawing rights issue the next time we want to do it, and we would target it to the Global South countries or to countries that met a certain criteria that would be determined by the IMF board. It would not be a general allocation. So that's a big picture idea that I think has merit. And I think it's the kind of reform that you could get more votes for in Congress for these routine matters instead of just going along like we have time and time again. And it's a way to refresh, I think, the dreams of 1945 and Bretton Woods and the dreams of the Eisenhower administration and the Inter-American Bank and the ability to engage in the Western Hemisphere then, and what we've tried to do in East Asia and across in the world, in my own work in Central Europe.
I guess one question, I mean, you brought this up earlier, which is that you've you said that you feel the IMF has mission creep. It shouldn't be focused on climate. It shouldn't try to act like a development bank.
Right.
So I'm curious where you think it shouldn't, what you see that you don't like today, and then how you think it should be reformed. And there are tensions at the IMF, at the World Bank. I mean, we saw, we've seen the tensions between the US and China play out in there. And I think that in a minute, I'm probably going to ask you about sort of a IBRD, allocation to the World Bank and what that might look like. But, it's going to play out there too, right? And so we're seeing all these tensions play out. How do you think, one, sort of what do you think reforms need to look like at the IMF? But two, how does this sort of relationship between the US and China inform all of what can happen, even if it's a good proposal? I think it's going to make things more challenging.
Sure. Well,
in a lot of these environments.
All of you live in a multilateral decision-making world, and it's not easy. And I admire you for dedicating your time and talent and energy into crafting multilateral type solutions to the world's problems. It's not easy work, and that's why I've proposed some of the ideas I've had. On the IMF, it's a balance of payments, short-term gap financer for a country suffering from exchange challenges or short-term dislocations. It is not meant to be a long-term development lender or a problem solver per se. It is supposed to create space, public finance space for that country to have reform opportunities to its budget and its long-term planning, and use other resources, local tax revenues if such exist, donor country contributions, development bank lending, trust fund support, but it is not meant to be itself doing that. And I think the IMF, we need that global foreign exchange credit maker more than ever because the United States, for example, has pushed a lot of our commercial banks out of that business after Dodd-Frank. I mean, we don't make that kind of lending, and our top global companies headquartered here, we don't do that like we used to. And then if they do the technical assistance side on the Ministry of Finance and the budgetary side, if they're doing transparency enforcement for other sovereign lending or global capital markets lending, the Eurodollar market lending, that would be a tremendous use of their time, and I support that. I don't support them trying to do the World Bank's job. On your point about China, look, China is a big country and with a current account surplus, and it's got its own financial challenges now. But it's active, in trying to, I would say, like all countries, looking at both self-interest and development opportunities. And my view there is, let's play by the same rules. If you're a sovereign lender, you're going to settle your debt disputes in the Paris Club. If you are a sovereign lender and want to be respected by the world and help country X achieve a new development objective, whether it's in infrastructure or something else, let's open the robe and show the transparency of what those terms and conditions are. And I think the only people to do that effectively, in my judgment, are the IMF and the World Bank, who have as a global mission helping countries, particularly the poorest countries, craft proper financing solutions.
So we talked a little bit about IDA replenishment. I think the other big question that is looming around the World Bank reform conversations is about a general capital increase. And I know that there was originally some money for IBRD included in a supplemental that was proposed by the administration, and that you wrote a letter that said that you didn't support that. So I'm curious whether you think whether you would support a capital increase, under what circumstances, and how likely you think that might be in the next couple of years. What does the World Bank need to do to convince you, to convince the US Congress that it deserves more capital?
Well, again, I won't hit replay on my list of reforms, but I've touched on the principal ones. They impact all these topics, whether it's an IMF reform idea or an IDA increase in capital or the World Bank itself. And I think, again, to my point about 2024, it's an election year. I think that's a tough topic. The issue about the supplemental, though, is about what is at hand. And Congress is very badly, it's absolutely for supporting Ukraine, our ally Israel, and Taiwan in a big,
Because
absolutely.
I don't know that as the general public, there's a sense that there is like support in the House that this will pass.
Well, it's there. I promise you it's there. And it's been there ever since the House Republicans chose to get off track by tossing Kevin McCarthy out of the speakership. And that's put a dent in the House's ability to function very effectively since October, in my personal view. But I think there is support for supporting those three countries and their defense of their sovereign territory.
And you were just in Ukraine.
I was in with President Zelensky
yeah.
two Fridays ago. Yeah.
So, in talking with him, how are you relaying sort of the situation in the U.S. where they have, they've said we need this money urgently, and certainly a lot of it is military assistance, and a lot of it is also assistance for the Ukrainian government. There's also about $10 billion of humanitarian assistance in that funding package, which I know for a lot of people in this room is quite important. What was the conversation like with Zelensky? What is at stake here? And does that experience help you come back and convince folks in Congress of why this needs to happen or help push things forward?
Well, it's my second trip to Ukraine in the past 6 months, and I was also in Taiwan last year once and Israel twice last year. So in my judgment, I try to stay on top of what our partners are asking and what the right response is for the United States. And I have certainly shared with my colleagues exactly my views on this. I mean, since Christmas, the Ukrainian military has been rationing ammunition and had a tough time for that. People in Congress on the Republican side of the aisle are asking, well, but President Biden did not give them the weapons, the lethality of equipment that they were asking for during the course of the 24 months. Some people in Congress would describe it as sort of slow rolling the precise equipment in the precise time frame needed in order to carry out that strategy of pushing Putin back and holding the line and advancing. But even with that said, and I don't disagree with that, and we could go, this is not the forum to go through that, but I don't disagree with that. That's a charge that can be made, and I don't think very easily defended. And I think I have a lot of Democratic colleagues that agree with that. But with that said, they have pushed and recaptured about 50% of the landmass that Putin had from 2014 on, and certainly since the 2022 full-scale invasion. And what have the Ukrainians accomplished this year that you don't read about in the press at all? They've reopened the Black Sea. The Russian Navy is cowering back around behind the Crimea Peninsula in the Sea of Azov, trembling that they will lose another very expensive, very important flagship. And as a result, the Ukrainians can open the route from Odessa through the Bosporus to the open market for fertilizer, for steel, for grain. And what does that do? Produces income, which produces the budget support need by the West to back the Ukrainian budget. And so that is one of the most important things that took place in 2023, for which the Ukrainians, I don't think, get adequate congratulations. And it's not recognized here by all the chattering classes in Washington. Oh my God, it's all stalled in Ukraine. I don't believe that to be the case. But it will be if you combine maybe Biden NSC temerity on giving them what they need with a lack of immediate response from Congress. So my pitch to Congress is, you're overdue. You're overdue. And it was the same pitch I made in October, November, December, January, February, and soon to be March.
Do you think the results will be different?
Well, I'm a very persistent person. Maybe you've picked up on that. And I will not stop describing what we should be doing here. And I'm willing to listen to other views in order to get that done. But I believe that in my view, Mike Johnson We got a lot of Mikes. Mike Johnson, Mike Turner, Chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Mike Rogers, Chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Mike McCall, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. It's the Mikes. We need the Mikes to deliver on this in the House. And I know you want to move on to another topic, but you could bring up the Senate bill. That's true. You could bring up a Fitzpatrick-Bacon version, but it has a lot of things left out of it, so it would have to be amended. You could bring up the Mikes. The Mikes may craft a bill and put it on the floor. And, at this stage, I'm like, let's just do something here, I'm a banker by trade. I'm a business guy. And so at some point, you have to stop talking and let's just do this. And so that's where I am on benefiting Ukraine. It is a 8-decade objective of the United States to limit the extraterritorial poor behavior and militaristic effort, first by the Soviets and now by the Russian Federation under Putin. Ask the Georgians. Ask the Syrians. Ask the Armenians and Azerbaijanis. And of course, ask the Moldovans. We haven't even gotten to Ukraine yet. Ask the Baltic states who literally don't know what might happen tomorrow emotionally. And let's ask the Ukrainians. And so there needs to be action here. And I would much rather a 71-year-old man I met in Germany being trained for the first time to hold a carbine and defend his country against an illegal invasion by a real thug that makes Stalin look like a slacker versus my 24-year-old son. And so to me, this is a strategic interest of the United States, the national security interest of the United States, and it's in the interest of Western values, however you all would like to define those in this room. I'm sure it's a rather diverse set of views. Not for me, but for many. But if you believe in democracy, human rights, freedom of choice, freedom of navigation, freedom of travel, and free to choose in a Milton Friedman context, this is the end of the road for Putin's adventurism.
I wanted to open it up to all of you to ask some questions. So I'm going to take a couple of questions and then we'll answer them and we'll see if we have time to get in a couple of rounds.
Sorry to take up that time.
You're good. Bobby, I think we'll go to you first.
All right, thank you. An easy question. I'm Bobby Jefferson. My background is technology and diversity and inclusion. So I was recently read that you've been appointed to the artificial intelligence. You're recently appointed to the Artificial Intelligence Working Group, bipartisan. Yep. I was very glad to see Ranking Member Maxine Waters, Representative Young Kim involved in that. So my question is, what's the role of policymakers in developing AI policy, especially in the financial sector, as that's a huge technology topic, and there's a lot of bias as well in AI. So
thank you. And I'll answer the question both from your area of focus as well as the big picture. This is the second iteration of this because Maxine Waters, when she chaired the committee several years ago, had a task force on artificial intelligence. I was the ranking member on that with Steve Lynch of Massachusetts. So our committee has been focused on this issue for some time. And now in this current Congress, Patrick McHenry, the chair from North Carolina, Maxine Waters from California, have formed a working group as opposed to a task force on AI for financial services. I chair it, and then my ranking member is Steve Lynch. So there's some continuity there. And then Mike Johnson, our speaker, announced last week a global AI bipartisan task force for the whole House, covering all the committees. And that's chaired by Jay Obernolte, who's a technologist and electrical engineer, Republican from California, and Ted Lieu, Democrat of California. So that's the playing ground. And of course, we're here in Microsoft's office, and Microsoft is a tremendous innovator and on the sort of the cutting edge of what are we all going to deal with on AI as a user and as from a standpoint of a transparency leader in among our technology companies. So now to the issue of the day. we've had all the financial regulators into the committee for an informal roundtable discussion. How are you using AI in the regulatory point of view? And how are you looking at AI from a financial services frame of reference when you do supervision of banks, broker-dealers, insurance companies, and consumer products over at the CFPB when you cross not just an institutional regulator, but a product regulator, where we have the SEC and CFPB are product regulators, and then the bank regulators are more focused on the entire, they're in charge of their institutions. So what's the source of data? This is your point. How is the data derived, and how are the models of machine learning training on that data? That's a key element, because if you're using AI to detect fraud, okay, if you're using AI to determine if you've made a compliance mistake, that's important, or look for an anti-money laundering target through that sea of open source data married with your FinCEN list, we sort of get that. But when you use AI to qualify somebody for a mortgage or for a home loan or for a credit card, the question is asked, well, how do you know that the machine learning model has chosen wisely? And are they in compliance with, in the case of the United States, a fair lending law or any kind of consumer protection law? And my first premise is sort of not unlike where the regulators work. Well, nothing you're using an algorithm for in machine learning exempts you from fair lending. So the first rule here is, and nobody expects that, by the way. No one's even asking for that. This is where it's more of you've got to have a little Reagan-esque approach here of trust but verify, and it's the verification in algorithmic machine learning that is troublesome. You can, but you can in every instance, and the more generative it is, the more discretion one might find there. And so I think the biggest challenge for us is complying with existing laws. How do you show your work? And then how does a regulator or a supervisor go in and see the work? So that's at a fundamental level. That's not very game breaking, but it's where AI could benefit households. More people might be qualified for a credit card or for a home mortgage or for a financial benefit if open source data was combined with in-company or in bank data to produce that. So that's number one. And then number two is, how do we use it for better fraud detection? How do we use it for security apparatus? How do we do it and use it in fraud relief? And all this is that basic tenet of an algorithm programmed by humans using data that humans know the data is being used in a not futuristic sort of way. And then we will work toward that futuristic part that people are jumping to. They're leaping to, a generative model that's out on its own. And that is, not per se what, typically you see in place today. But it's going to be an exciting premise. But we want to, first do no harm, but we also want to be outlined. We'll be talking to the Pentagon about their own use of AI and their own principles-based approach, and see what we can learn from that as we talk to our financial regulators.
I want to get in one more question.
Sure.
I'm going to go to Stephanie.
Thanks for this conversation, Representative Hill, and thank you for the discussion on World Bank reforms. So my organization, Accountability Council, and several others, we have worked with communities that have unfortunately experienced negative impacts from projects when projects go wrong. And so there have been different cases. Maybe you're familiar actually with the Bridge International case that's happening right now in Kenya, where a World Bank group, IFC project has, there have been sexual exploitation of minors in that project. And so I would love to hear from you just how the US can help ensure that when harms happen to communities through World Bank projects, that there's a quick response to remedy those harms before they can exacerbate and then undermine the goals of the World Bank to address poverty and also reputational issues around the World Bank and even the US government in that. So
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's such an important question. And again, we're back to that puzzle of effective management, oversight in a multilateral context. because your precise question, I was in a meeting with the Secretary General at the United Nations on, and his deputies on a very similar issue around UN peacekeepers and UN, activities in deployed countries as well. And boy, is that complicated. At least we can argue inside the World Bank, we have an entity. It has a board of directors, it has a CEO, and it has a line management structure where we ought to be able to craft remediation, termination, not retribution, but reconciliation on getting that done right. So we certainly support that, and that's an idea, again, as it relates to these increases in World Bank resources, where we would welcome people's viewpoints on how to increase that transparency, but also the outcomes from it, But I raised this trust fund issue about how we use trust funds because it does extend the ability of leveraging resources short of a capital increase and possibly in an effective way. And I feel the same way over at the UN. I literally pulled every UN trust fund and read the 3-page summary of it in the financial statement for it. Some of them are ancient, meaning there is no sunset. They're just out there. But it made me have a theme, both for the World Bank use and over at the United Nations, would be, what's the purpose? Who's asking for this? Who is the principal financial supporter, and why are they so enthusiastic about it? Or did you beg them to do it, and then they said, okay, I'll do it? And this would be applied to the United States too. I'm not saying the U.S. didn't invent the idea of the trust fund idea. So I'm being very ecumenical here in my view of trust funds. Mission, who's the lead financial sponsor? Who's teamed up to do it? What's the expected outcome? And does it have a sunset? Are we going to end this trust fund at some point in the future? So I think you bring up a great point about line management and human rights aspects in projects. And it's, to me, just as important, something like that, when you're delivering World Bank resources to a country, as someone who has non-transparent terms, has a predatory process on removing minerals for a country or oil and gas interest, delivers a faulty project and the dam collapses, or the bridge collapses, or they build a community college in a city where there are no students and no teachers. So accountability is tough and multilateral, but as members and as leaders of the United States of America, we should be demanding transparency and accountability. So thank you.
I think with that, unfortunately, we are out of time, though I'm sure we could have continued this conversation much longer.
You can catch us streaming for the second hour,
But I really appreciate
Sure,
you
of course. Happy
being
to do
here and sharing your insights. I think I probably speak for everyone in the room that we've learned a lot and gained a lot from your perspective.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Being
Appreciate it. Thank you all very much. Thank you. It's great. You do it. Excellent job.
Right. We will just be setting up for our next panel in just a second.
was good conversation. Very good, very good, very good. Hello.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Testing 1, 2, 3. I wonder if I turn this way. I'll pick it up. Okay. Okay.
All right, everyone, I think we are all set. So next up, I want to introduce our partner, Food for the Hungry, for a discussion on the relationship between resilience and the localization agenda for development work. We'll be having a lively discussion on whether current approaches need to be adjusted to better support locally led development and how we can better achieve more effective development strategies. So we're pleased today to have Sarah Rose, who's Senior Advisor for Localization at USAID, along with Jonathan Papalidis, who's Vice President of External Engagement for Food for the Hungry. And our moderator will be Kate Warren, our Executive Vice President and Executive Editor at Devex. So welcome, everyone, and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Anna. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And again, thank you for Food for the Hungry for being our presenting partner on this series. This is the second of a bipartisan series we've done where we're really focusing on global leadership, on global development issues. And while we just had a really fascinating conversation about a lot of multilateralism, another area where we see a lot of leadership from U.S. government is on localization. Obviously, USAID has a very ambitious target of directing 25% of funding to local organizations, and there's a lot of discussion around what that means. But I think we're all in agreement that working towards a localization goal is an important aspect to development work. Before we started today, I think about whenever we're convening in DC, localization is probably the first topic of conversation, or whether we call it locally led development or localization, whatever term du jour. I know it's something we're all really thinking about. But something else we're also really talking a lot about is the importance of resilience, building resilience into our systems. And we've seen from COVID, climate crisis, how critical that is. But what we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about is how those two interact and how localization can help reinforce resilience and vice versa. So that's what we're really excited to get into today. So Jonathan, I would love to start with you. And why is it that you think it's really important that we be looking at localization and resilience together in the same lens? And what are some approaches you think can be used to do that?
Great, thanks, Kate.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. So, we live in an age of crisis. Kate just mentioned, we have COVID, we have increasing conflict, extreme poverty is getting higher again. We're seeing a rapid urbanization, Islamification, high debt distress, economic shocks. And countries that are the most vulnerable to any of these shocks on a given day are experiencing multiple shocks all at once. And this has resulted in the higher demand from these countries and communities within them for resilient type solutions. So any talk about a locally led development agenda or localization agenda is increasingly going to require having some kind of resilience response as part of it. It's going to be a feature of that system. The question about what's the best approach to take, I think, is trickier. Devex recently did a piece on the World Bank's survey of client countries and their priorities. And in that survey, we see that 11th in the ranking as a priority is climate resilience. And at the top of the list are things like education and health and food security and so forth. And one might be tempted to then say, well, it turns out it's not that much of a demand at all. It's not really locally led. There's another part of the survey that asks the question, how concerned are you about things in development? And there you see the client countries saying, well, water scarcity, public health crises, economic shocks, worsening disasters, and climate change are all top of the list. This is in Asia, this is in Africa, this is Latin America. So on the one hand, you see this really high demand, as I spoke about, but you see a deprioritization or kind of a lack of interest in what's on offer right now in terms of the climate resilience sector. And they have reason to say this, because when you look at climate resilience as a sector, it's kind of a la carte in terms of the approach, right? There's initiatives there for resilient infrastructure, resilient sort of climate, smart agriculture, but it hasn't coalesced into an actual strategy, kind of a systematic approach to doing this work. And I think the demand we're seeing from the locally led agenda from countries and communities is to be much more strategic and intentional about bringing resilience to their problems. So I think the best approach that we can take is to start with those high categories of priority on the list of these countries, which is education and health and food security and so forth, and begin a process of making the systems that deliver food and health more resilient, right? And we're seeing this now from some first movers in the space, like USAID. They're committing to not just doing resilient food systems, but resilient health systems and education systems and social protection systems, using a framework that focuses on sort of absorptive capacities and adaptive and transformative, such much more systematic. But we need this to be not the exception to the rule, but the new norm as well. And so this is really where I think we need to go as an approach, because it's really investing in these sectors for resilience that becomes the engine of how we do resilience in society.
So in our previous conversation with Representative Hill, he talked a little bit about concerns around mission creep maybe, and feeling like if you're trying to solve everything at once, maybe you're not going to do any of that well. So I'd love to hear a little bit how we think about building resilience into localization, and hear your perspective, Sarah, on how you at USAID are thinking about those working together. And is it in conflict with each other, or actually can they help complement each other?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kate, and thanks for the opportunity to actually have this conversation about the intersection of resilience and localization. I think it's such an important one, and it's really important to be able to elevate these issues as equally important, even when we're talking about how we're thinking about why we do this kind of work. And so, Jonathan, I just want to appreciate the framing that you put out about resilience too, given all the different kinds of shocks and crises that the world faces today. USAID has long talked about resilience, and we talk about it as a way to think about how we can prevent or reduce these recurring humanitarian needs. A lot of times we talk about that in terms of extreme weather events related to the climate crisis. But the state of vulnerability is really basically defined by being vulnerable to a range of different kinds of shocks. And so thinking about how can you withstand, get through, and maximize well-being, even when those occur, in all kinds of risks that an individual or community might face, ends up being really important. And so localization is actually really critical for fostering resilience in a lot of ways. So at USAID, when we talk about localization, what we're talking about is the efforts that we're taking as an institution to shift how we work, to make sure that we are putting local actors at the center of our work, strengthening local systems, and trying to be more responsive to local communities. I think the reason that we do this is, for a number of reasons. And one of those reasons really emphasizes this linkage between localization and resilience. And so one of the key linkages between localization and resilience is really just about this idea that there's a lot of convergence around that when development work, when humanitarian work is more locally led, when there is more local leadership and ownership over goals, over processes, when it incorporates local knowledge, then it is more likely to be effective, it is more likely to be sustained, it is more equitable too, as a matter of fact, as well. And so there's also a lot of, again, agreement, there's some literature that points to this, that when we think about integrating local leadership, integrating local knowledge, having local feedback and accountability kinds of mechanisms, and that this is where we get to more effective results. And this is especially true when environments are very fluid or unpredictable. And it is in these very environments where resilience really has much that real value as well. Let me just frame here too, when we talk about resilience, the starting point for the conversation about solutions is very much not a starting point about what is the intervention. It's about what is the approach to figure out how to do that. And localization is very much about what are those approaches to be able to get local knowledge, local ownership, local leadership about how to determine what it is to do. Let me also just highlight one other thing. We talk a lot about localization, but localization is best talked about in tandem with this idea of inclusive development, which recognizes that there is a plurality, there is a multiplicity of different types of actors in a community, in a country, and that all of them have, value and merit and a need to be able to be brought into sort of the development progress of this as well. And so localization in general and in pursuit of resilience, in the absence of that sort of inclusive lens, risks reinforcing, existing power dynamics that may not lead to the kinds of outcomes that we would want to see, and doesn't get to where we ultimately want to be. But the other angle I really want to highlight too, in addition to sort of that local leadership angle, is just around the local systems framework as well. So, Jonathan talks about trying to get local systems to be more resilient, to be able to enable resilience as well. And so, local systems thinking and practice is really about understanding that interconnectivity among these different actors that exist within a system. And it really requires this deeply nuanced local view of the context. And so I just want to highlight quickly, USAID has a local capacity strengthening policy. It's a little over a year old at this point. And the very first principle of that policy is start with a system, start with a local system. And what it really encourages USAID to do is think about, capacity strengthening, not as just building the capacity of a local actor to develop a particular intervention, to get towards a particular result, but think about how to build the capacity of a system as a whole. How do you strengthen an actor to play a strong role within that system in which it finds itself? And I just want to highlight, I know I'm going on too long here, but I do want to highlight one example, because very recently our Bureau for Democracy, Rights, and Governance has released a series of papers that really look at lessons learned related to locally led development and the approaches that they use for governance and civil society. And one of the really interesting findings from that related to, the need to think about how USAID is shifting its programs now, its programs related to civil society, not to have so much instrumental kinds of interventions that focus on maybe how do we get a particular civil society organization to influence a policy, but really more of a broad focus to think about how do you scaffold and support civil society as a sector, right? How do we think about strengthening that relationship that civil society has to its constituents, et cetera, in order to make it stronger and able to respond to a variety of different things that come up as well. So let me stop there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you kind of sharing some practical examples. So Jonathan, I'd love to hear how does Food for the Hungry think about incorporating resilience and localization? Do you have some examples of how you do this?
So FH turned 50 a few years ago. And as part of that birthday, we initiated a new, what we call reimagination process, basically looking at the global trends in development and the needs and the risk environment for the next 30, 40 years. And we've just produced a new global program model that we think will be responsive to this age of crisis. And it's really, for me, a fusion of resilience and localization. Resilience here being something that will touch multiple systems where we work: education, health, water, sanitation, social protection, so forth. But it's a recognition not only of how important resilience will be to the future in terms of these crises and shocks and stress, but also a recognition that how we've gotten to where we are as a global community in terms of advanced economies, long-term growth, peaceful societies, poverty eradication, has always had a resilience component to it. If you look at the work that USAID has done with ODI on poverty escapes, the World Bank has done on long-term growth, and the work they've done with the UN on pathways to peace, it all puts an emphasis on resilience. For us, this is important because we want to support resilient communities and systems, but we also want to make resilience a sort of a pathway for development, for flourishing in the future as well. So we've made resilience really central, and we're taking a systems approach like Sarah has outlined as well. The other thing we've done is to say that we cannot do this without a localization strategy and agenda, right? We are convinced that we have to see the people that we support really as sort of shareholders, right? That we continually make value for and take direction from. Without that, you kind of lose the plot in terms of who you're supporting and what you're working to provide. But you're also losing that ownership level of what's really appropriate and what's going to work in a specific place. In some cases, savings groups work. In other places, they become debt traps for people. In some places, irrigated water solutions work. In other cases, they don't need it. So the same solution could have a really good outcome in one place, but not in another. And unless you're actually enmeshed in the local communities, understanding preferences and priorities, but taking a kind of a systems view as well, and that means not only a political economy view of what are the root causes causing vulnerability and stress and risks and so forth, but also a social view, how are people coping, then we don't really think it's fit for purpose. We have to go beyond the sort of community interventions into more of these broader approaches, and we have to do it with a resilience-informed approach to localization.
And so Food for the Hungry, your name would maybe presume that you focus on hunger initiatives, and you talk a lot about resilience, localization, these systems approaches. I'd love to hear how you all think about the systems approach. And we talked a little bit earlier with French Hill around, again, that mission creep and being focused on things that might lead to better outcomes than be focused on everything. But I'd love to hear how you think about resilience as being a critical way of approaching maybe even specific problems.
So resilience has a lot of definitions and a lot of use in different sectors. And we see the most progressive approach to resilience or definition is one where you're identifying complex risks and crises in a particular place, but you're also identifying what's driving those. Patterns of clientelism, marginalization, exclusion that deny people access to services and support and market opportunities and jobs. And you use a kind of a systems thinking approach to say, how do these things all connect? How do we look at root causes, the risks they produce for very vulnerable groups, and then the crises that come out, and how do we address this? And that gets tricky too, because when you look for solutions, when you look for frameworks, there's a whole bunch out there. Some talk about principles, some talk about one-off interventions, how you do a particular resilience intervention in the water sector. But more broadly than that, there's been a kind of a quiet revolution of resilience where there's a framework approach that says, focus on supporting the absorptive capacities, the adaptive capacities, and the transformative capacities of systems, of communities, of institutions, and of markets. And apply this, again, to the root causes, the risk, and the crisis. And USAID uses that framework. We see it in the OECD, we see it in the World Bank, and so forth, but it hasn't all joined up yet. We're kind of talking past each other. We have the same framework that we're using in our program model as well. And so we need to sort of a coming together to say, here's the approach, and let's be very specific about the kinds of resilience we're building to certain risks of crisis. And then it's about looking at what are the sectors that you could use to build that resilience. So safety nets, water, sanitation, health. A lot of resilience, especially in the US context, is sort of connected to food security, right? There's been a lot of learning there, but it does vastly apply to other risks in other sectors, as Sarah had just mentioned. And so we need to sort of have a much more holistic approach to resilience, but not, I think part of what Representative Hill's criticism is that resilience is this sort of sector that I mentioned before. It's a la carte. It's drawing a lot of money out of health and education and kind of just leading to these kind of piecemeal projects. That's not what we're talking about here. We're really talking about resilient health systems that are both formal and informal at the community level, and how do you make those resilient? And I think this is really the ambition, but it's really a big, ambitious task for any particular organization. So it needs a much more joined up approach. And so one could say that we're on the verge of a sort of a new paradigm in development now towards resilience, but it's going to take a global village and it's going to take a local village.
And Sarah, do you have any thoughts on how USAID thinks about that systems approach and the resilient systems approach, and marrying that with your localization approach, and realizing you work across many different sectors, but how you can do the the yes and of addressing food and health and all of these challenges, but with a systems holistic approach?
And I think about, I think USAID is thinking about this in a number of different ways, and is establishing like a policy foundation for this, as well as some practical pieces to help that really be implemented in practice. And I'll refer back again to the local capacity strengthening policy. Again, this is a real shift in how we think about doing capacity strengthening. I mean, capacity strengthening is something that's been built into sort of donor, funder aid kind of work for a very long time. But again, the idea is that this would shift more to thinking about how do you think about strengthening a system as opposed to just a particular result. And that has implications for how you would seek to do capacity strengthening work as well. You may be looking at things more like fostering networks or peer-to-peer learning, as opposed to things like training that are often thought about when we're talking about capacity strengthening, for instance. We have implementation plans that we have developed and are continuing to develop to be able to sort of put that capacity strengthening, that new lens on capacity strengthening into practice. But it really is more thinking about what is that system focus. I also want to highlight that USAID is in the process of updating its 2012 resilience policy. It should be out in the coming months, and the update will really emphasize the importance of local leadership in fostering resilient local systems. And so very much sort of marry these two concepts together in terms of thinking about how does local leadership and resilience work together. But I'd also like to make the link to practice too. So 10 years ago, back in 2012, USAID released its local systems framework. And this really, oriented around how to think about, how to integrate systems thinking into USAID's work and why it's important to think in a systematic way. A lot of the principles that framework put forward, they still matter, right? Start with a local system, map the local system, integrate local knowledge. But 10 years on, we found that there's a scope and opportunity to think about how we can refresh and elevate that same policy with some practical ideas for what does that mean? Because some of that's been trickier, right? Whether that's because of time, lack of guidance, sort of perceived complexity of some of the ways to really think about how do you integrate that into the work that you're doing. And so that will be coming out, and it gives another opportunity, as does localization really, to talk about the different kinds of approaches that we can use, many of which we're already using, but how to sort of really intentionally link those to some of those systems and resilience kinds of processes. Kate, at the very beginning, you mentioned USAID's goal to target 25% of its funding directly to local actors. That's an important part of localization, but a big part of localization is this broader look at how do you integrate local leadership and locally led development and local system strengthening into everything that we do. And so again, some of these issues are things like how do we better integrate political economy analysis into our work, right? How do we use our locally led development, checklist tool, right, to really think through like how we're taking advantage of some of these kinds of opportunities. How are we doing collaborating, learning, and adapting in ways that really, integrate radical listening into how we do it? How are we co-creating with local actors? And we're starting to track some of these things too, including, the extent to which we're doing co-creating. I mean, ultimately, there's no real single way to be able to link resilience and localization and system strengthening all together. But the core of it is about approaches that really involve listening, they involve learning, and they involve adapting based on local knowledge and local experience.
Right. Well, in our final moments here, I'd love to hear from each of you. What would your call to action be for the development practitioners here in the room or tuning in online on how they should be thinking about localization, helping to bolster resilience and vice versa in their work? Jonathan, I'll start with you.
I would say look for the systems approach, right? Look for something that's more strategic than the a la carte menu of a little bit here, a little bit there, and really start investing in this emerging discourse that we're seeing around resilient health systems and education systems and social protection. The US Treasury has made a really big push to get resilience into the World Bank, this evolution process. And it's because we're in this place of crisis that the bank had poverty reduction and prosperity, economic growth as its twin goals for a very long time. But the major disruptions to long-term growth and poverty are shocks and stress. And so move beyond the buzzword of resilience at this point, move beyond just thinking about it as a side of fries to the main meal, and start thinking about it as sort of a full course that you use aid, both humanitarian and developmental, to double purpose for resilience and for meeting local needs.
Sarah?
So for me, I think the call would be to help share learning and share experiences, right? In a lot of ways, this is a little bit of a change, right? It's thinking about how we can prepare systems and actors to respond to things that are unforeseen, right? And so that is a little bit of a different shift than a lot of development work, is sort of in the past, historically, traditionally. And so I think it is really useful to make sure that we continue to have spaces for these kinds of dialogues and very specific dialogues about how is it that we can collaborate together to best sort of put these approaches into practice. Again, whether that's orienting capacity strengthening around the strengthening of a system, whether it's about fostering networks, et cetera. and how can we continue to learn from each other to make sure that we can adapt and do it better. So thanks.
Great. Well, just as a heads up, and end of March, we're going to be launching a content series on locally led development. So this is definitely an issue we'll look to report on and dig in further. But for now, I'd just like to thank both of you for sharing your time today. And thank you for the Hungry for being our partner for today's event. So thank you both.
Thank you.
And thank you, Kate, Sarah, Jonathan, for a terrific discussion. Just a reminder, this event was recorded, so if you do want to watch it, it will be on Devex's YouTube channel. We also, as Kate mentioned, have several events coming up. We've got tomorrow, actually, the Future of UK Aid. We've got another pro virtual event that will go inside Chinese aid on March 4th. And we will have a presence at the World Health Assembly in May in Geneva, so stay tuned for that. You can learn about all of our events and everything going on at Devex by signing up to our daily newsletter, the Newswire, as well as our various individual newsletters, including Weekender, which is exclusive to our pro subscribers. Once again, I want to thank our sponsor today, Food for the Hungry, as well as Microsoft. And please stick around. We do have a few minutes left for networking. So thank you, everyone.